Cool. Well, I'm gratified and grateful for this turnout. I actually expected after ML SecOps I'd have a complete drain out of people who were interested in that and actually wanted to stick around for the testing. So it's validating to me as a lifelong tester, and it's also very good to see because I think people are maybe understanding, maybe after CrowdStrike, that testing actually is kind of an important thing that we need to do. Does anyone remember that thing that happened a little while back that actually impacted a couple people, from what I understand? I knew that it was going to fade from memory, probably not from this crew as much as maybe others, but it was fascinating, I think, just because we looked at that thing immediately and were like, I suspect a type 2 error, and I'll get into what I mean by that in here in a few minutes, because just to give you the hypothesis for this talk in the first couple minutes, spoiler alert, I think they call it, I don't think AI is going to replace our jobs as testers. Who am I talking to, by the way? Is it testers, developers, developer managers, anyone in test involved? Oh my gosh, I'm not talking to a QA audience, so I apologize in advance if I say things that are just sort of assuming an amount of knowledge related to testing. So try to correct me if I use a term like blue-green refactoring, anything like that that's kind of just out there. But anyway, we want to talk about testing today because it's been in the news lately. I don't know if you know, in the last 48 hours there's been a major outage with Verizon, and this morning worldwide outage with Salesforce, which has had a little bit of an impact on my own company since we're trying to wrap up the quarter. And turns out to be, testing's kind of important, both from a functional standpoint, security standpoint, perimeter edge point standpoint. It's, kind of important. So I'll talk a little bit about who I am. We'll talk about how testing impacts financial institutions in particular, and these three different categories. And then I'm going to tell you about three problems that I consider to be intractable, inarguable. You can tell me you're mitigating them, you're helping solve them, but they are not solved problems. And it's funny because I wrote an article for VentureBeat that I'll give you a link to. It came out, I submitted it 4 months ago, it was published 2 months ago, and it's already horribly out of date. So that's just the way that goes. I just have to be the guy who was wrong. Yeah, whatever. It just happens. And yeah, spoiler alert, AI can't solve everything. I think y'all all know that by now. I heard the last gentleman's talk, very spot on. I think it was really good. So the bad news is that people out there all the time, I work for a testing company, I'm a lifelong tester. I think that there's this attitude out there that I'm going to get AI to replace all my testers, and then I'll have quality, right? And for someone like me, I immediately, my first reaction is, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my influence or whatever. But the truth is, there still needs to be a human holding the rudder. And the problem is that the human still needs to be there for the hardest part. So I apologize, even though I have no reason to apologize personally. AI is not going to do the hardest part. AI is going to help with the easiest parts. And in my opinion, hopefully I'll have you convinced by the end of this, that's where we should start, not start with having AI automate the hardest part. I don't know why we do that. But there's probably 50 companies out there, venture-backed, started within the last 3 years, trying to solve the hardest problem. And I'm here to tell you there is a boatload of money in there for people who want to solve the easiest problems. And so maybe we can get to that. So a friend of mine says, testing is so easy that even a developer can do it. I don't know what the, it always gets more of a laugh than I think it will. But I think that's just the world I live in. I've been doing testing now for 26 years. I actually started off as I started off in video games, but mostly I worked in database extraction, ETL, prototyping, stuff like that. So I was a big Perl guy. Perl, regular expressions, engineering, database, stuff like that. I kind of miss it. But then I got into testing because I think a friend of mine, I still don't know to this day if it was a compliment or an insult. He said, I think you'd be really good at testing. And I'm like, don't really know what you meant by that. I think something about being detail-oriented and able to explain myself. Seems like we should all be that, but hey, that's cool. So I think this quote's funny just because I have found, hot take coming in, that GenAI is better at helping with development than it is at helping with testing. And yet, if you look at headlines over the past year about how many people whose jobs have been lost because we're going to use AI for testing, and they fire people before they even understand that the use case is not even well defined yet, it turns out AI and shift left are just kind of an excuse to cut budget, not an excuse to actually, not actually a realization of the end goal of having replaced the tester. So, and as a result, what do? We get CrowdStrike. So Yeah. It turns out you have to check for null pointer exceptions. If you have a null pointer exception, it is your fault. And those rules are immutable in the laws of computer science. I'm sorry, but it shouldn't take a tester to explain that to people. So let's talk about stages of maturity, and I think this is particularly applicable to financial businesses because we work with a lot of banks at my company. This is not a pitch, so I won't go into that, but what we find is that people in the banking and finance industry are a little bit stuck in 2012 way of approaching testing. So we're a little bit on the left here. I don't know how many identify with this, where dev and QA are separate. Actually, this is a little bit. Most teams I talk to are more like here. Like QA is involved, testing is involved. They're talking to each other. They don't have an antagonistic relationship with each other like they did back in the early 2000s, late 90s. And then, so we're doing CI. We're deploying regularly, like every 3 weeks, every month, something like that. And then we test constantly. Now, used to be back this. Does anyone remember this, where you just, you released once a year and you tested kind of whenever you had to? Okay, I think those days might be over. Anyone still there? I understand if you don't want to raise your hand. But moving to the right, I think this is where most of our customers are right now, who are in that place. And our duty is to pull them as appropriate, not before they're ready for it, but to pull them more to the right, where there's tight collaboration between testing and development. Because we need to move to the right. And so what that leads to is a graphic I forgot to put on here, which is essentially there's a continuum between iterative releases and continuous releases. Somewhere along that line is where you are. And then there's another continuum from top to bottom that says, am I testing for coverage or am I testing for the risk profile of my business? What I mean by that is I was told once by a CTO, and I'm a test architect, and he says, you need to show me your code coverage numbers for all of the tests that you're producing, because that's going to tell me whether or not our software is high quality or not. And at that point, I'm like, oh, man, another one of these people, right? Code coverage metrics is a great input into telling you what work you have left to do. It is not a trophy to put on your desk and say, I have quality, right? And so that's where, when we move to the right, we start to say, what are the top risks to our business? If this thing fails, what happens? If my software prevents an operating system from booting up, I'm sorry, I keep going back to it. If my software prevents an operating system from being able to boot up, and there are tens of millions of people who depend on that operating system who don't even understand that I am in the picture as a dependency for that. Have I modeled that threat out? Have I modeled out that kind of risk? No, I didn't do that. I was worrying about increasing the code coverage to my profile management for the users for 1% of my customer base that uses that piece of the software that doesn't produce a single dime of revenue. That's what I was focusing on. I wasn't focusing on threat modeling for risks in functional testing. So that's what we are finding back in this area, where QA is kind of it's both an afterthought and a burden and a nuisance and a cost center. Now, as we move to the right, it becomes less and less of that, but I still find people treating it like that, when in fact we should be a strategic ally to the developers. And that's what we're trying to get to. And that's how I think AI has an opportunity to help us become more strategic, even though it's not going to replace us. I'm sorry. So, by the way, if I end up, I think they're going to have me do the slides. I've decided, and I want to try to make this a trend in a presentation. When I produce a GenAI image, I'm going to give you the prompt I used. And I want everyone to start doing this. This is how we become transparent. I'm going to tell you which model I used and what prompt I used to get the image. I feel like that's one way we can help try to promote transparency in this. Because what if we find that there's a little thing in here that we can verifiably tell was plagiarized from something that it shouldn't have actually been spelunking in terms of training its model? We should be able to point to that and say, here's the prompt that reproduced it, and then feed that back into. I use ChatGPT 4.0 for this, and so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. I think that we should be transparent about the prompts we're using. Anyway, I think that AI has a massive role to play in test data generation for financial institutions. It can produce real-world simulated sets of data that can do an amazing job at giving you what you need in order to build a whole database for testing. That is one of the biggest things I see from our banking customers right now, is they're missing this. They're missing a corpus of data that they can use to feed into their system to do functional testing on real-world complicated scenarios where fields are sometimes missing and things are misspelled and there's some non-printable characters and some jackass wanted to do some SQL injection to find out. You can use AI to help you generate full real-world data sets that you can use to test input sanitization and all sorts of stuff. Of course, you have to worry about hallucinations, because you always have to worry about hallucinations. I won't even go into it, but that's the kind of thing that I can help with. I'm sorry I'm blazing through this, but this is a brief talk. So the next thing that I think you have to work with is complex workflows and microservices. Now, this is obvious, but when you're filling out a loan applications, there's what, 20, 30 steps to this? There's a bunch of steps I have to do as a customer. There's a bunch of steps your people have to do as analysts. There's a lot of underwriting. There's so many processes in that. And once again, AI can help you work through how to generate the scenarios for these things. The thing it probably can't do is generate the code that you need to do in order to write the test. But it can generate the steps. It can help you with all the different combinatorial complications of working through those scenarios. Now, there's one thing I also forgot to put on here is there's a technique called pairwise testing. It's a way of taking an extremely complicated set of test data and reducing it down to a minimal number of steps that can guarantee you a certain amount of scenario coverage. I use the word coverage again, but it's actually a pretty great technique. If I had more time, I would go into it. This is more of an overview. But we need to make sure that these workflows that need to be secure, they need to capture both universal and individual complexities. And we need to help brainstorm through that. And we need to be able to conduct, like an orchestra, how we work through these different workflows. And then we can start to be accountable, and we can guarantee the business that for this kind of loan process or this kind of tax whatever you call it, workflow, I can get through this and guarantee you that I've tested 1 million of the most common scenarios, or 2 million, or uncommon things, or I've done all sorts of security testing against it. And I can do fraud detection. I could probably use AI to generate all sorts of fraud scenarios that would maybe get picked up and stuff like that. That's the way I've been able to use GenAI so far. Is everyone wants to jump to the end and have it help you write the code, and it just, I'll get into it. It's not great at that. It's almost great at that. It's a leg up. It's a boost, but it just doesn't give you the final product that you need. You need your brain, but this is very, very helpful for getting to those things. Regulatory compliance, I mean, good grief. This is our lives, isn't it? You need to be able to say that it works the way you say it does. You need to be able to say that it works the way your people specified that it should. You need to be able to say that it works in compliance with the law in whatever jurisdictions you serve. And here's where I point out that in Europe, sometime in June of next year, all software overnight in June is going to be expected to be accessible from a regulatory point of view. You need to be able to make sure that users you have customers in Europe have to be able to use your software. Meaning like contrast and all sorts of stuff. I won't go into accessibility, but regulations that like that all the time that are changing, you need to be able to guarantee certain amounts of output. Regulatory with AI, GenAI is possible. It can help you, once again, it can help you massage the data. It can brainstorm. But you do need to worry about giving it the reins. You can't hand over all of your power to it. The previous gentleman I was talking that was talking here was saying this is where machine learning is a better fit than generative AI, because that way we can use pattern analysis. We can figure out what's going on in our customer data. We can generate scenarios that way, rather than simply relying on these generative algorithms that are not necessarily trustworthy. So here's where we talk about the three, what I would call intractable risks of incorporating AI into your product. And this is, I'm talking just as much about using it in your daily work as I am about embedding it into your software. Mostly I'm talking about embedding it into your software, like giving a chatbot to your customers. We were talking to someone just yesterday who's working on this, and they're saying, how do you test these chatbots to make sure that they are actually accurate all the time? And I'm like, boy. I'm sorry. I have a suggestion at the end. There's a gentleman who's out there doing amazing work on this exact topic. I'll give you his name, send you to his LinkedIn. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy. And the thing is that he's probably his name is Jason Arbon, A-R-B-O-N. He is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met who is working on the problem of how to get AI to help us test. And the problem is that it takes someone with his 24/7 dedication to this problem to figure out how great it is. And we need him to do all that work so that we can benefit from it, because it's just that complicated. So hallucinations, everyone knows about hallucinations, right? We love to go on Twitter and see all the latest examples of the great. I actually had started to build a little set of examples of hallucinations, but I know that's kind of a big TikTok game right now. Like we love talking about how it tells you to put glue on pizza. It's fantastic. But I'm not going to go into that. But what I do need to point out is that Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, recently said that they are an inherent feature of generative AI. They cannot be made to go away. They can be mitigated with several techniques. They can be dealt with. You can turn temperature down. You can do all sorts of stuff to control the results, but you cannot eliminate them completely. So when you're dealing in a regulatory environment where you have to be fairly deterministic in what you're talking about, it seems to me pretty crazy to trust the machine to this level. And what I have seen personally is that there's 4 states. Like testing is a complicated, more art than science in some cases, but at the end of the day, you have a test that either passed or it failed, right? And if the test is passing and the feature is correct, that's fine. If the test is failing, but the feature is correct, that means something's wrong with your test. Your test is wrong. So it fails, and you have a signal, and you go and analyze it, and you say, oh, I need to go update my test because what's happening in the product is actually fine. It's just out of date. I need to update my test, update the expected results, and this will be fine. This is a fairly normal workflow for testers. And then you have a case where, I'm going to go to the red one last. The test is failing, and the feature is correct. I found a bug. Yay. Test automation found a bug. That's fantastic. It's a big red letter day for you. However, what I have found on multiple occasions, so I said earlier, there's 50 companies-ish that are out there trying to say, hey, we'll use AI to automate your testers away. And 3 times now, I have been kind of deep in one of those products and found this. The feature is broken and the test passes. Why? Because the machine didn't have the context to understand what it was seeing, and it tried its damned little heart out to try to figure out a way to make you happy and turn that test green. And this is a profound problem that I've seen in these tools. I've seen it in, by the way, I'm sorry. I said there are 50. I have tested 3. All 3 did this, where I basically said, I want a test. The example was a little bit complicated, but I'll see if I can go through it a little bit. The example was a table full of data. That data is updated on a fairly regular basis. So data is up here, and then as you import more data, it moves down. I said that at the end of this test, I need this table cell to be ABC. And I ran that test 400 or 500 times. ABC had actually scrolled off of the page, and it was replaced with like XYZ. And basically what it said was, well, I mean, there were 3 letters there. There were 3 letters there, and at the end of the test, I figured you wanted 3 letters. And surely you didn't want that to say ABC, did you? I'm like, no, absolutely, I wanted it to be ABC. See, it didn't understand my intent. And that's the key with all of testing, is the intent of the user. Intent-based testing, to make sure that this machine understands exactly what I was trying to do. Now, you could tell me that my prompt wasn't good enough. Maybe you're right. Maybe I could have spent a few days tweaking that prompt, but at that point, have I really saved myself any time or effort? You know, I don't know. This is all going to get better. I know it's going to get better. But right now, we have lost far, far, far too many jobs in the testing industry with too many of these things left in the wings for us to have any confidence that this is actually going to work anytime soon. Now, if you just generate the scenario and you still write the corrective tissue between the scenario and the test script itself, then you might be able to live with this. But I mean, at this point, I mean, this is a fireable offense for a human tester. If you have a green test that's actually supposed to be failing, we haven't found actual evidence yet, but I would bet you all a nickel that there was a test in the CrowdStrike test suite that should have caught that problem. But they all passed, and so they shipped it. We already know that they said it was a test software problem, but I mean, we see this kind of thing all the time. A test that is green that should have failed is so much worse than a test that should have passed but was red. The truth is, it's all bad. Like, we should be on top of our test data. And that's the problem, again, going back to the idea of coverage versus risk. We spent all of the 2000s and most of the 2010s writing more tests, getting more coverage, having a trophy that says, hey, I've got 8,000. Today I've got 9,000. But not really understanding or interrogating as the product changes and as things evolve. What are those things actually doing for me? My bet is you could probably delete 90% of the tests that you've got. I don't care where you're sitting, what your situation is. You could probably delete the right 90% of your tests. Keep 10% of the ones you've got. Run them far more often. Keep them green, and you will be in a much better state of quality than the old world of bloat and cruft laying everywhere. And you know what? AI can help you do that. So that's, if you you go into the thing and you say, what's the biggest risk to my business? It's going to do a pretty damn good job of telling you what that is. Now, you shouldn't. You should go talk to your BI people, your product people, your executive. What keeps them up at night? I'm going to test that. And I'm going to make sure those tests are green every single day, every single time I go. Every single time we put this thing through the ringer, those tests stay green. Those 10 tests, those 40 tests, not 8,000 where 30% fail, and I don't care because I don't have time to look into it. If you're living in that state, try to break out of it, because I know a lot of people are. So, what can we do? Like about hallucinations. I mean, we can fine-tune, we can do RAG models, we can do chain of thought prompting. I don't know if you're familiar with this, where you can work through with the model. You can say, and then what, and then what, and then what. It's far better at that than giving it a giant prompt and letting it go through the spaghetti. I hear Strawberry's pretty cool. I haven't gotten to use it yet. Anyone use Strawberry yet? Is it still called Strawberry? Is this the new OpenAI thing? Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm afraid OpenAI is going to stop being a nonprofit before we actually get a hold of it. Then what I worry about is feeding AI into other AI, and you get what's called, anyone familiar with the Habsburg jawline? Familiar with that, what that means? That's when the Habsburgs, a very famous, I believe, Prussian royalty, was inbreeding multiple generations after generation, and all sisters marrying brothers, that kind of thing, and you have this jawline that starts to extend after 100 years. And that is what I am afraid of we get Habsburg AI when we start to do multi-generational training models upon models upon models. Because what I've read, and I don't know, I'll credit Ed Zitron for this, but I checked his sources, but I don't have his sources handy, is that there isn't enough data in the world for us to actually train away from hallucinations completely. And also, by the way, I'm sorry, but the data that we're using to train is all based on human data, and human data is deeply flawed. And Reddit gave them the keys to the kingdom. So Reddit is now being built into all of this. So, I mean, it's a crazy situation that we're in right now. Non-deterministic output, Mira Marathi, who just resigned on Friday, says that the AI models that we see in public are almost the same as what they've got behind the scenes. So when you have non-deterministic output, you're locked in. This is what we've got. You can set the temperature to 0 and you can get the same output every single time, so you can give yourself some certainty. Problem is, that non-deterministic output that you generated the first time, or the deterministic output that you generated the first time, could be full of shit because it's hallucinating, and then you get that same thing every single time. So it's great, this non-determinism, for brainstorming, helping you think through some processes. Boy, it's so good at working through writer's block. Anyone used it for that before? It is brilliant at that. However, what if I'm in a regulatory environment that needs deterministic answers the same way every single time? Testing tends to work that way. So you gotta worry about that. Use these things for their strengths. Don't use it to do the analysis, because in my experience, you simply can't trust the answer. Give it a sentence like the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and say, how many occurrences of the letter E on there are in that sentence? It'll probably get it wrong. If it can't tell you how many E's are in a single sentence, can you trust it to say, analyze these million rows of data and give me some coherence? No, this is what machine learning is for. This is where we need to learn the correct use for the correct tool. Use the LLM to help you understand the outputs of the analysis, not to do the analysis itself. And for God's sake, have a policy. It's fascinating. I was with a customer a while back, and this was just after my company published its own policy, basically saying, don't use LLMs at all until we tell you otherwise. Which, say what you want, that is a policy. They were saying, well, we have no policy. And I'm like, I would rather someone have a draconian don't use it policy than nothing at all. Because I don't know what liability I'm exposed to. I don't know which competitor's data I'm pulling into my data set. Like, I don't know what's going on if I don't have some kind of a policy. Furthermore, if you're in any relation to the sales side of the house, I was with a customer who asked us, what are you doing for AI? And our answer was, I could see our salesperson wanting to jump, hey, we're doing everything with AI. We're going full force on AI. He didn't know what he was talking about. And I could smell something. And I was kind of like, hey, Grit, we've got machine learning and AI. We've got all sorts we've been using AI in our product for years. We're not going to put an LLM in there until we can tell you a little bit more about how we're going to do it, what benefit you're going to get out of it, transparency, not feeding your data back into its model, and making sure that we can tell you what it is doing underneath the covers. We're not going to give you a tool with that much uncertainty into it, Mr. or Mrs. Bank, who is highly regulatory and amenable, accountable to the government for a certain amount of correctness. Like, if we had told them we're going full force and you'll have your chatbot next week, they would have pulled us into another review for their policy, and it would have delayed closing the deal for 3 months at least. So not only beware, have a policy, but if you're in the business of providing this to other people, you need to have a policy. All right, I've got 3 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about energy consumption. I'm not going to talk about very much. But I think we all understand by now that this is on track to consume more power than the Netherlands. And given the fact that, like, take yourself through this. 15 years ago when the cloud first started being a real thing, 2007, 17 years ago. When someone starts talking about the cloud and all the amazing things it can do, you can immediately understand it, right? There's a bunch of computers in the sky. I can rent. I know how to deal with that. This is still in the idea phase, ideation. We are still being given a whole bunch of promises that have not yet come true. Not really, in a lot of cases, even come close to coming true. I got a person I work with who told me a year ago that because of generative AI, high school will not exist in 5 years. Because he's listening to Ray Kurzweil and all these folks. And it's like, dude, it's been a year and not one thing has been done in that direction except students are cheating more effectively. So energy is being consumed at a rate like this. Like, I have a feeling cloud dwarfs this, but we're getting a lot of benefit out of the cloud. What is this thing actually doing for us yet? It's doing a lot, but it's not doing all that. It's not doing enough to justify this. Boiling the oceans to give us a worse idea of what the past used to be. That's a quote from Ed Zitron. I can take no credit from that. Quantum computing, sure. More efficient algorithms, sure. Do we even care about the environment? I don't know. I feel like we're kind of too late on some of that. The thing I'm afraid of, though, is that once we get to quantum computing, once we get to more efficient algorithms, what are we going to do? It's twice as efficient. We're going to ask 10 times more of it. So we're always going to be asking more of this thing than it's giving us, probably. The last thing is, I am afraid that because of the money that is being put into the OpenAI furnace, even as they are talking about no longer being open source and replacing their board of directors, every week at this point? There are a lot of people investing a lot of big B, 10-digit billion dollars into this thing. And right now we're paying $20 a month for it. At some point that bill is going to come due. Now, I understand that's the way this game works, right? Cloud used to be really, really cheap, then they raised the price. Uber used to get you across town for $5, and now it costs the regular amount of the taxi driver costs. I understand. That's the game. We're in the game. The problem here is I'm embedding this in my product, and I'm reselling that to my customers. I'm calculating ROI based on 2024, based on the models that I'm running in my data center, and I'm putting that into my product, and I'm selling it to my customers, and I'm getting a margin. I'm saying, hey, look how much value I'm adding, even though it may be ephemeral. Problem is, in 10 years, these people want their money back. What's that going to do to ROI in 5 years, 8 years, when these things start charging the cost they actually cost? What's that going to do to our margin? We have to pass that on to our customers, and then everything gets more expensive. Now, once again, I understand. That's how the game is played. I'm just saying, keep it in mind when you go through these exercises. because AI has taken over the world. I understand it. I mean, we're not going to get Skynet, but we are going to get a lot of this in here. And I'm not saying it's all bad. But I think I get the impression a lot of times people think I'm down on AI, shockingly. The truth is, I'm not down on it. I use it every single day. The thing is, let's not let these folks get away with overpromising again on something the same way we were done with Bitcoin and crypto, the same way we've been done with a half a dozen other things, metaverse, VR, all that stuff. It's funny, I dabble in all that stuff, but I don't think it measures up to the hype, because it objectively doesn't. So let's not let ourselves be bamboozled. Let's at least be on the right side of it when we come out of it. Let's not let it boil the ocean to give us very little in return. Let's hold folks accountable. Let's use it responsibly. Let's keep things in mind as we put them in place, and not just assume that, it's going to load my dishwasher in 5 years, right? Let's not imbue it with magic power. So OpenTest.ai is Jason Arbon's project, where he actually has a set of subjective measures he puts every model through in order to evaluate whether, or like, how bad are they at ethical reasoning? How bad are they at, these kinds of things? And that way you have more of a transparent look on how these things are actually going. Now, I am a minute over. I didn't talk about open source one single time. I apologize, but these are open source projects that my company supports, and I'm on the board of directors of the Selenium.dev project, all big in testing, big testing projects. So I would love to talk to anyone who wants to after this. This was definitely not a project pitch, because we don't have a single product that is related at any way to anything I've said, except for this slide right here. So I'm happy to talk about testing with anyone who wants to nerd out, or how to prevent the next CrowdStrike or anything like that. Great.